Everyone called her Ugly Valetia until the vampire prince saw her as he kissed her scars. He whispered, "These marks are your royal seal." But the real shock was something else entirely. The morning mist clung to Shadowmere Castle like a funeral shroud, and Valetia pulled her tattered woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders as she hurried through the servants' corridors. The rough-hewn stone walls seemed to whisper her shame with every echoing footstep. Ugly Valetia, Monster Face, the Devil's Daughter, Cursed Child. The cruel names followed her like hungry shadows, carved into her soul as deeply as the 3 jagged scars that marred the left side of her face. The scars ran from her temple to her jaw in twisted, raised lines that puckered her skin in ways that made children cry and adults turn away in disgust. They were a permanent reminder of the fire that had claimed her family's cottage when she was barely 12 years old. 7 years had passed since that terrible night, but the memory burned as fresh as ever. The flames had spared her life, but marked her forever, transforming her from a prosperous merchant's daughter into a castle outcast, existing in the grey spaces between servant and prisoner. The transformation hadn't been immediate. For the first few days after the fire, lying in the village healer's hut, with her face wrapped in bandages soaked with honey and herbs, she'd held on to hope. Perhaps the damage wouldn't be too severe. Perhaps the scars would fade with time. Perhaps she could still have the life her parents had dreamed of for her. Marriage to a good man, children of her own, a place in respectable society. That hope had died the moment the bandages came off. Martha, the village healer, who had delivered half the town's children and seen every manner of injury and disease, couldn't hide the shock in her weathered eyes. The other patients in the hut, a farmer with a broken arm, a woman recovering from difficult childbirth, an elderly man fighting off lung fever, had gasped audibly when they saw her face. Some crossed themselves against evil, others muttered prayers under their breath. Even Father Benedict, the village priest, who was supposedly a man of God's infinite compassion, had struggled to meet her eyes when he visited to speak of divine plans and mysterious ways. His hands had trembled as he made the sign of the cross over her, and she'd heard him whisper something about Satan's mark when he thought she wasn't listening. The children who had once been her playmates now screamed and ran when they saw her approaching. Margaret, who had shared dolls and secrets with her since they were toddlers, had hidden behind her mother's skirts and sobbed when Valetia tried to speak to her. Thomas, the blacksmith's son, who had shyly given her wildflower bouquets, now crossed the street to avoid walking on the same side as her. Within a month of leaving the healer's hut, it became painfully clear that no family in the village would take her in. The fire had killed her parents, destroyed their home, and consumed their modest wealth, along with everything else they'd worked their entire lives to build. She was a burden no one could afford to carry, made exponentially worse by the superstitious whispers that followed her everywhere like a toxic cloud. Some villagers claimed the scars were a sign of demonic possession, evidence that she had made some dark bargain to survive the flames that killed her family. Others suggested she had somehow caused the fire herself, through witchcraft, sacrificing her parents to save her own life. A few brave souls defended her. Martha, the healer, old widow Cromwell, who remembered her parents fondly, the young baker's apprentice who had always been kind to everyone. But even their voices grew quieter as the gossip spread and solidified into accepted truth. The breaking point came on a grey October morning when she was found sleeping in the burned ruins of her family's cottage, surviving on scraps begged from the few villagers who still showed her mercy. She'd been there for 3 days, huddled under a piece of charred timber that provided minimal shelter from the autumn rain, too proud to beg for a place indoors and too hopeless to try building any kind of new life. Lord Ravenclaw's steward, a practical man named Heinrich who cared little for superstition and much for efficient castle management, had found her there during his monthly tour of the estate. He was conducting an inventory of damaged properties, assessing what could be rebuilt and what should be cleared away, when he spotted movement among the ruins. "Girl," he'd called out in his clipped, business-like tone, "come out where I can see you properly." She'd emerged from her makeshift shelter slowly, painfully aware of what she must look like dirty, desperate, marked by scars that seemed to glow against her pale, malnourished skin. But Heinrich, unlike every other adult she'd encountered since the fire, had looked directly at her face without flinching, without crossing himself, without any visible reaction at all, beyond professional assessment. "You're the grain merchant's daughter," he'd said matter-of-factly, "the one who survived the fire." She'd nodded, unable to trust her voice. "Castle needs servants," he'd continued, pulling out a small leather-bound ledger and making notes with a stub of charcoal. "Kitchen work, laundry, general cleaning. The work is hard, the pay is minimal, but you'll have food and shelter, and no one will bother you about your appearance." It was a business transaction, nothing more. He didn't offer pity or false comfort, didn't pretend her situation was anything other than what it was. A scarred girl with nowhere else to go would work harder than most for less compensation, and the castle could always use reliable servants who had no other options. "You'll work primarily in areas where guests won't see you," he'd explained as she gathered her few possessions: a torn shawl that had been her mother's, a small wooden cross her father had carved, a singed book of stories that had somehow survived the flames, kitchens, laundries, storage areas. "Keep your head down, do your tasks without complaint, don't cause trouble. Your quarters are in the servants' wing, fourth door on the left. Meals are at dawn, midday, and sunset. Miss a meal, and you go hungry. Break something valuable and it comes out of your wages. Try to steal and you'll find yourself back on the streets faster than you can blink." For 7 long years, she'd followed those rules with meticulous, desperate care. She rose before dawn each day to tend the great hearth fires that warmed the castle's main halls, spending her mornings hauling wood and cleaning ashes, and ensuring that the flames never died down enough to chill the noble residents. Her days were spent scrubbing stone floors until her knees bled through her rough skirts, hauling endless buckets of water up countless flights of stairs, and cleaning chamber pots without complaint or expression of disgust. Her evenings were devoted to mending torn linens by candlelight, scouring cookpots until they gleamed like mirrors, and washing the soiled clothing of servants who ranked higher in the castle's complex hierarchy. She made herself invisible, useful, indispensable in the way that only the truly desperate could manage. But invisibility came with its own kind of cruelty. The other servants tolerated her presence, but never truly accepted her as one of their own. They would fall silent when she entered a room, their lively conversations dying until she passed by and disappeared around a corner. During meals, she sat alone at the far end of the long wooden table, listening to laughter and gossip that always seemed to stop just beyond her hearing. On cold winter nights, when the servants gathered around the kitchen fire to share stories and songs, she remained in her small chamber, mending clothes by the light of a single candle stub, and trying not to think about how alone she was. The loneliness was a living thing that gnawed at her from the inside, growing stronger with each passing year. Sometimes she caught herself talking aloud, just to hear a voice, even if it was only her own. She created elaborate conversations in her mind, imagining what it would be like to have a friend, someone who might look past her scars and see whatever person existed beneath the damaged surface. The castle's noble residents were even worse than the servants in their casual cruelty. To them, she wasn't even real enough to ignore. She was simply part of the castle's furnishing, as unremarkable and functional as the stone walls or wooden floors. Lady Ravenclaw had looked directly through her countless times while requesting fresh linens or complaining about dust, never acknowledging that an actual human being was providing these services. The Lord's frequent guests sometimes noticed her scars with idle curiosity, the way they might observe an interesting architectural detail or an unusual piece of furniture. Their attention never lingered long enough to recognize her humanity, and their comments, when they bothered to make any, were discussed as if she couldn't hear them. "Dreadful thing, isn't it?" she'd overheard Lady Pemberton say to her daughter during one particularly memorable visit. "One wonders why they keep such creatures around, where guests might see them. Surely there are enough unmarked servants to handle the visible duties." "Perhaps she's particularly skilled at something," the daughter had replied with the casual cruelty of youths. though I can't imagine what use such an unsightly person could possibly have. Only the children seemed to truly see her as an individual, and their reactions were often the cruelest of all. The young lords and ladies visiting the castle would point and whisper, creating elaborate games around avoiding the monster servant. She'd overheard them making wagers about whether touching her scars would bring bad luck, or inventing increasingly wild stories about how she'd acquired her disfigurement. I heard she was struck by lightning, sent by God to punish her family's sins. One boy had whispered loudly enough for her to hear.
My governess says she was born marked by the devil.
A girl had added with delicious horror. Father says scars like that come from making deals with witches. Another child had contributed knowingly. In their innocent cruelty, they stripped away even the protective numbness she'd tried to build around herself, leaving her raw and exposed, and reminded constantly that she was different, damaged, unworthy of the basic human kindness that others took for granted. But Valethia didn't yet know the dark truth behind her scars. Now, at 19, she had perfected the art of existing without truly living. She moved through the castle like a ghost made flesh, completing her assigned tasks with mechanical precision, while her mind retreated to the stories she told herself. Elaborate tales of faraway places where scars meant nothing, where a person's worth was measured by the kindness in their heart rather than the smoothness of their skin. She'd salvaged books from the ruins of her family's cottage, volumes of poetry and adventure stories that had somehow survived the flames that consumed everything else. During her rare moments of free time, she would read these books by candlelight, losing herself in worlds where damaged people could become heroes, where love conquered not just evil but indifference and cruelty, and all the small daily rejections that made life feel impossible to bear. Sometimes she would even write her own stories, scratching words onto scraps of parchment with a quill she'd found discarded in the castle library. These stories always featured heroines who were marked or scarred or considered unlovable by their societies, who found ways to transform their perceived flaws into sources of strength. Valethia, the sharp voice of Mistress Gertrude, shattered her morning reverie like breaking glass. She stopped abruptly in the corridor, nearly dropping the bundle of soiled linens she was carrying to the laundry. The head servant stood at the junction of two hallways, her iron grey hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch the natural sourness from her weathered face. Gertrude had been managing the castle's servants for nearly 30 years, and she ruled her domain with the efficiency of a military commander and the compassion of a headsman's axe. In all her years at the castle, Valethia had never seen Gertrude show favoritism to any servant, male or female, young or old, experienced or new. She treated everyone with the same brisk impersonality, judging only on the basis of work completed and duties fulfilled. It was perhaps the closest thing to fairness that existed in Valethia's world, even if it came wrapped in constant criticism and impossible standards. "Stop your wool-gathering, you worthless girl," Gertrude snapped, her pale grey eyes scanning Valethia with the same expression she might use to examine a piece of questionable meat. "Your duties have changed. Effective immediately. Set those linens aside. Someone else can finish the washing." Valethia obeyed immediately, though confusion gnawed at her like hunger. In 7 years of service, her routine had never varied by so much as a quarter hour. She knew every stain on every stone of the laundry room, could navigate the castle's kitchen in complete darkness, could predict exactly how long each task would take down to the minute. Change was dangerous. Change meant attention, and attention was the last thing someone in her position could afford. Gertrude thrust a heavy iron key into Valethia's calloused hands. The metal was old and elaborate, covered in strange markings that seemed to shift and writhe when she wasn't looking directly at them. The key felt warm against her palm, almost alive, and something deep in her chest responded to its touch with a flutter of recognition she didn't understand. "The East Tower," Gertrude said, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "Top floor, daily meals, and cleaning. You're not to speak to anyone about what you see there. You're not to ask questions about your job. You're not to linger once your tasks are complete. And you're certainly not to show curiosity about things that don't concern you. Do you understand?" The East Tower. Valetia felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Every servant in the castle knew about the East Tower, though none spoke of it openly, except in the kind of whispers usually reserved for ghost stories and childhood nightmares. The tower stood isolated from the main castle, connected only by a narrow stone bridge that spanned a dizzying drop to the rocky ravine below. On moonless nights, when the fog rolled in thick from the moors, strange sounds echoed from the tower's heights, not quite human screams, not quite animal howls, but something that combined the worst elements of both. Sometimes servants reported seeing lights moving in the tower's windows, lights that flickered in patterns that hurt to look at directly. No servant had been assigned there in living memory. The few who had ventured near the tower on dares or official business had returned either mad with terror or not at all. Old Agatha, the previous head cook, who had worked at the castle for 40 years before her death, had once whispered that the tower was cursed, that it contained something too dangerous to destroy, but too valuable to release. "What's in the East Tower?" Valetia asked, her voice barely audible even in the corridor's stone-amplified quiet. Gertrude's weathered face darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She stepped closer, close enough that Valetia could smell the strong lye soap and bitter herbs that always clung to the head servant's clothing and skin. "Questions will see you thrown from the ramparts, girl," she said, in a voice that carried absolute conviction. "Lord Ravenclaw's orders are explicit and non-negotiable. He has little patience for curious servants, and even less for those who fail to follow direct commands. You bring food, you clean whatever needs cleaning. You speak to no one about what you encounter. Not to other servants, not to visiting nobles, not even to me unless specifically asked. The chamber on the highest floor, that key opens only that door, one task, one chance to prove you're worth keeping alive." She leaned even closer, and Valetia could see the fear lurking behind the older woman's stern expression. The last girl who asked too many questions was found at the bottom of the ravine 3 days later. The official story was that she lost her footing on the bridge during a storm, slipped on the wet stones and fell to her death. But there hadn't been a storm for weeks, and Mary had grown up in these mountains. She knew how to navigate treacherous paths better than most. She was sure-footed as a mountain goat and clever as a fox. The implied threat hung in the air between them, like morning mist. Valetia nodded quickly, clutching the strange key so tightly that its ornate edges cut into her palm.
"I understand, Mistress Gertrude. No questions, no delays, no discussion of my duties with anyone."
"Good." Gertrude's expression softened slightly, and for just a moment, Valetia glimpsed something that might have been pity in the older woman's pale eyes. "Listen, girl, I don't know why Lord Ravenclaw specifically requested you for this assignment. In 30 years of service, I've never seen him take notice of any individual servant, let alone one who—" She gestured vaguely at Valetia's face, unable or unwilling to speak the words directly. "Just complete your tasks quickly and efficiently. Stay out of trouble, and don't let curiosity get you killed. There are far worse fates in this world than serving in a haunted tower, but there are also far better ones for those who know how to keep their heads down and their mouths shut." With that ominous blessing, Gertrude turned and strode away, her footsteps echoing with military precision down the stone corridor. Valetia stood alone in the hallway, turning the mysterious key over in her hands and trying to imagine what could possibly be important enough to break 7 years of carefully established routine. The weight of the key seemed to burn through her palm as Valetia made her way toward the East Tower. Navigating corridors she'd cleaned hundreds of times, but had never really examined closely. The main castle bustled with its usual morning activity. Other servants scrubbing floors with brushes that left their knuckles raw and bleeding, tending fires that had to be maintained at precise temperatures for the comfort of noble residents, preparing the endless succession of elaborate meals required to feed Lord Ravenclaw's household and frequent guests. The familiar sounds of domestic life, clattering pots, scraping brushes, muffled conversations, the occasional bark of an order from a higher-ranking servant, gradually faded as she approached the narrow bridge that connected the main castle to the East Tower. It was as if the very air grew thicker and more oppressive the closer she came to her destination. She'd only crossed this bridge once before during her first week at the castle. A group of the other servant girls had dared each other to walk to the tower and back, treating it like a test of courage that would determine their place in the castle's complex social hierarchy. Valetia had joined them in desperate hopes of gaining their acceptance, of proving that she was brave enough to belong despite her appearance. The expedition had ended in disaster, as most of her attempts at social connection did. Sarah, the kitchen maid who seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting anyone weaker than herself, had pretended to stumble halfway across the bridge, claiming that Valetia's cursed presence had made her lose her footing. The other girls had agreed loudly and dramatically that scars like Valetia's were clearly a sign of dark magic, and everyone knew that dark magic brought nothing but bad luck to anyone foolish enough to associate with it. They'd abandoned her on the bridge, running back to the castle, while shouting warnings about the demon-marked girl who might contaminate anyone who came too close. She'd completed the crossing alone, more to prove to herself that she could than for any other reason, but the experience had taught her to avoid seeking acceptance from people who were determined to reject her. Now she had to cross the bridge alone again, carrying food for whatever creature waited in the tower's highest chamber. The bridge stretched before her like a stone pathway to another world entirely. Ancient blocks of grey granite, slick with perpetual moisture from the ravine's depths, formed a span barely wide enough for two people to pass safely. The sides were protected by a low stone railing that reached only to her waist, offering minimal comfort against the dizzying drop below. She forced herself forward, one careful step at a time, trying to ignore the way the morning wind whipped through the ravine with surprising strength. The gusts tugged at her woolen cloak and threatened to upset her balance, making her clutch the food basket tighter against her chest. Halfway across, she made the mistake of looking down and immediately regretted it. The world seemed to tilt and spin around her like a child's top, knocked off balance. The ravine's depths were shrouded in perpetual shadow, making it impossible to judge exactly how far the fall would be. Jagged rocks jutted from the darkness, like the broken teeth of some massive predator, and her imagination supplied helpful details about what would happen to anyone unfortunate enough to tumble into that abyss. The sensation of tumbling through empty air, wind rushing past, as the rocks below grew larger and more defined, the final impact against unforgiving stone, bones shattering like glass, dropped on a hearth, the way her broken body would lie undiscovered in the shadowy depths until ravens picked her bones clean and scattered the remains to the four winds. Her palms grew slick with cold sweat despite the autumn chill, making her grip on the food basket precarious. The key in her pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if it were made of lead rather than iron. "Don't look down," she whispered to herself, a litany she repeated with each careful step. "Don't think about falling. Don't imagine what it would feel like to lose your footing. Just keep moving forward, one foot, then the other." Almost there, by the time she reached the tower's entrance, her legs shook like autumn leaves in a high wind, and her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to bruise. An ornate wooden door bound with iron bands stood before her, carved with symbols that seemed far older than the castle itself. The markings weren't letters from any alphabet she recognized, but something far more ancient, curves and spirals, and interconnected lines that seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm, as if they were alive and breathing. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond. A cool breeze flowed from the opening, carrying scents that didn't belong to any earthly place she knew: night-blooming jasmine, deep forest moss, and something else she couldn't identify. But that made her skin prickle with inexplicable anticipation. She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, leaving the familiar world of the castle behind. The tower's interior was a stark contrast to the castle's bustling warmth and constant activity. Here, cold stone steps spiraled upward into shadow, lit only by narrow, arrow-slit windows that barely allowed the grey morning light to penetrate. Each step echoed with hollow loneliness, and she found herself counting them to keep her mind occupied and her growing fear at bay. 20, 30, 40 steps, and still the staircase continued upward into darkness. The walls were bare stone, but as she climbed higher, she began to notice details that seemed inconsistent with the tower's apparent age. Some of the stones bore tool marks that looked fresh, as if they'd been carved recently by a master mason. Others showed the smooth wear of centuries, polished by countless hands and endless weather. Occasionally, she glimpsed symbols carved into the mortar between blocks, the same strange markings she'd seen on the door below, though these were smaller, more subtle, as if they were meant to be hidden from casual observation. When she tried to focus on them directly, they seemed to shift and change, like words written in a language that transformed itself based on who was reading it. By the time she reached the fourth floor, her legs ached and her breath came in short gasps that created small clouds in the increasingly cold air. She'd climbed countless stairs during her years of service, hauling water to upper floors, carrying messages between different levels of the castle, cleaning chambers that seemed designed to be as inconvenient as possible to reach. But something about this tower made each step feel like it weighed twice what it should. The air grew thicker as she ascended, not with dust or staleness, but with a kind of presence that made her feel like she was walking through invisible spider webs. The temperature dropped noticeably with each floor she climbed, until she could see her breath and feel the cold seeping through her woolen cloak. The fifth floor landing held only another set of stairs, leading upward into deeper shadow. The sixth floor was the same, offering no doors, no chambers, no relief from the endless climb. It wasn't until she reached the seventh and final level that she found what she was looking for. A single door waited at the topmost landing, heavy oak, reinforced with iron strips that gleamed despite the dim light, secured with 3 separate locks that looked like they'd been forged by master craftsmen in some distant city. The wood was so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the iron bindings were covered in more of those strange, shifting symbols, these ones larger and more elaborate than any she'd seen during her climb. The key in her hand suddenly felt insignificant against such impressive barriers. 3 locks suggested that whatever lived behind this door required multiple layers of security, as if a single lock, no matter how well made, couldn't contain whatever waited on the other side. She approached the door cautiously, her footsteps seeming unnaturally loud in the tower's oppressive silence. But as she drew closer, she realized something that made her heart race with a mixture of relief and new terror. Only one of the 3 locks was actually engaged. The other 2 hung open, their mechanisms unlocked, as if someone or something was expected to arrive. As if the creature behind the door knew she was coming and had prepared for her arrival. The real reason for Nocturnus's admiring gaze would shock her. Valethia's hand trembled as she inserted the key into the single locked mechanism. The metal turned smoothly, with none of the resistance she'd expected from such an ancient-looking device. The lock clicked open, with a sound that seemed to resonate through dimensions she couldn't name, and immediately she felt a change in the air around her, a subtle shift in pressure and temperature, and something else entirely that she had no words to describe. She pushed the door inward, and it swung open on hinges, so perfectly balanced, they made no sound at all. What lay beyond defied every expectation she'd formed during her long climb up the tower's spiraling stairs. Instead of a dungeon or torture chamber, instead of the moldy cell filled with instruments of torment that she'd imagined, she found herself looking into what could only be described as a gentleman's private study, transplanted from some nobleman's manor house. Rich tapestries covered the stone walls, depicting scenes of moonlit forests where silver stags danced beneath star-filled skies. Thick Persian rugs covered the cold stone floor, their intricate patterns seeming to tell stories of distant lands and ancient magic. A canopied bed dominated one corner of the chamber, draped in dark velvet curtains that seemed to shift and move, despite the absence of any breeze. Books lined shelves along every available wall, more books than she'd ever seen in one place, their leather spines bearing titles in languages she couldn't read, scripts that seemed to writhe and change when she tried to focus on them directly. A massive writing desk sat beneath one of the tall windows, its polished surface covered with papers, covered in elegant handwriting, bottles of ink in various colors that seemed to glow with inner light, and quills that looked like they'd been fashioned from the feathers of exotic birds that had never flown in earthly skies. A comfortable reading chair, upholstered in midnight blue silk, faced a fireplace where warm flames crackled and danced, despite the fact that she'd seen no chimney smoke from outside the tower. The entire chamber radiated warmth and comfort and a kind of refined elegance that seemed completely at odds with what she'd expected to find in a supposedly haunted prison tower. But it was the figure seated by the tall window that stole her breath entirely and made her forget every reasonable thought she'd ever had. He was beautiful in the way that fallen angels might be beautiful, perfect features, touched with an otherworldly paleness that spoke of centuries rather than mere mortal years. Dark hair fell in waves to his shoulders, framing a face that could have been carved from marble by a master sculptor who understood that true beauty contained both light and shadow. His clothing was elegant but simple. A white shirt, open at the collar to reveal skin that seemed to hold its own luminescence. Dark trousers that looked like they'd been tailored by the finest craftsmen in London or Paris. When he turned toward her, eyes the color of deep garnets, like wine held up to candlelight, like rubies set in silver, like blood and fire and midnight, all combined, met hers directly. For a moment that lasted either seconds or centuries, the entire world stopped spinning on its axis, and she forgot how to breathe. "You're not Wilhelm," he said, his voice like aged whiskey poured over black velvet, with just the hint of an accent she couldn't place, but that suggested education and refinement and origins far more exotic than the English countryside. "Wilhelm has been bringing my meals for— how long has it been now? 40 years? 50? Time loses meaning in places like this." Valeria stood frozen in the doorway, clutching the food basket against her chest like a shield that might protect her from the intensity of his gaze. This was the creature she'd been sent to tend, this magnificent being who looked like he'd stepped from the pages of a romantic poet's most fevered dreams. Where were the chains, the bars, the evidence of imprisonment and danger she'd expected to find? "Wilhelm died last month," she managed to whisper, her voice sounding harsh and common after his cultured tones. "Lung fever took him. I'm Valeria. I've been assigned to take his place." The man, if man he truly was, rose from his chair with fluid grace that reminded her of water flowing over stone, of wind moving through tall grass, of every beautiful and natural thing she'd ever seen. As he stood and moved, she noticed details that her initial shock had obscured. He was tall, perhaps 6 inches taller than herself, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean strength that spoke of excellent breeding and centuries of careful maintenance. His movements were too precise, too controlled, as if every gesture had been practiced to perfection over the course of ages beyond counting. There was something about his eyes that went beyond their unusual color. They held depths that seemed to contain the wisdom and weariness and accumulated sorrow of countless lifetimes. And there were the chains. As he approached, she finally noticed the restraints that marked him as a prisoner rather than simply an eccentric nobleman. They were nothing like the crude iron shackles she'd expected to see. Instead, delicate-looking silver links encircled his wrists, so fine and beautiful they might have been jewelry crafted by master artisans rather than restraints designed to hold a dangerous creature captive. The chains themselves were longer than she'd anticipated, perhaps 15 feet from each wrist to where they disappeared into the stone walls, allowing him considerable freedom of movement within the confines of the chamber. The silver gleamed with an inner light that was almost hypnotic to look at directly, and when he moved, the links chimed together with a sound like distant church bells, carried on a winter wind. "Valeria," he repeated, as if tasting her name like a rare vintage wine, rolling each syllable around in his mouth before releasing it into the air between them. A beautiful name for a beautiful woman. Heat flooded her cheeks like liquid fire, and she instinctively turned her head to hide the scarred side of her face behind her dark hair. Beautiful. The word was so foreign when applied to her that she almost thought she'd misheard him, that he'd meant to say something else entirely. "You're mocking me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Am I?" He moved closer, the chains chiming softly with each step, the musical sound somehow managing to be both beautiful and ominous at the same time. "Look at me, Valetia," something in his voice, not commanding exactly, but requesting with such gentle authority that disobedience seemed not just impossible, but unthinkable, compelled her to raise her eyes to meet his gaze. She expected to find mock. Instead, she found something that made her heart race and her breath catch in her throat like a wild bird trapped in a cage too small to contain it. Genuine admiration shone in those garnet depths, as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever beheld in all his long years of existence. He looked at her the way she'd seen men look at beautiful women in the village, with wonder, with desire, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts or natural miracles. But his gaze didn't avoid her scars or try to look past them as if they didn't exist. Instead, his eyes traced the lines of twisted flesh with something that looked almost like recognition, as if he saw something there that no one else had ever been able to perceive. "What's your name?" she asked, setting the food basket on a small table near the door with hands that shook slightly, despite her best efforts to appear calm. "Names have power, particularly in places like this, where reality bends around will and intention," he said softly, gesturing around the elegant chamber with one chained hand. "But you may call me Nocturnus. It seems fitting for one who has not seen the sun in so very, very long." How long? The question escaped before she could stop it, though she immediately regretted her boldness. Servants weren't supposed to ask personal questions of their charges, especially not charges who were apparently prisoners of some kind. If he was offended by her curiosity, he gave no sign of it. Instead, he settled back into his reading chair with natural grace and gestured toward a smaller chair nearby, an invitation she found herself accepting, despite every instinct that screamed she should complete her tasks and leave as quickly as possible. "Time has little meaning in this place," Nocturnus replied, his chains allowing him to lean back comfortably while still maintaining perfect posture. "The days blend into nights, and the seasons pass without leaving much impression. But I remember the year I was brought here quite clearly, 156, according to the Christian calendar. The world was very different then." Valetia's hands stilled in the process of unpacking the simple meal she'd brought, bread that was still warm from the ovens, cheese aged in the castle's deep cellars, wine that had been carefully selected from Lord Ravenclaw's private stores, and roasted fowl that smelled of herbs and spices. She couldn't identify. 156. That was nearly 400 years ago. "That's impossible," she breathed. "You'd have to be dead." His smile revealed teeth that were perhaps a shade too white, too sharp, too perfect for any mortal man. "Yes, by all rights, I should be nothing but dust and forgotten memories by now. But here we are, you and I, defying impossibility together in this place that exists between worlds." She stared at him, her mind struggling to process the implications of his words. 400 years of imprisonment, 4 centuries of solitude in this tower, with only occasional visits from servants to break the endless monotony. The thought was staggering, terrifying, and yet somehow deeply tragic. "What are you?" she whispered. "Does it matter?" He leaned forward slightly, the chains at his wrists catching and reflecting the firelight in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. "I am a prisoner, just as you are. Different cages, perhaps, different bars, different kinds of chains, but cages nonetheless. I'm not a prisoner." His words cut deep because they contained too much truth to dismiss or ignore. For 7 years, she had been a prisoner, not of stone walls and iron bars, but of her own shame, her own fear, her own internalized acceptance of the world's judgment about her worth and value as a human being. "You've made yourself smaller and smaller each year," Nocturnus continued, his voice gentle but relentless in its accuracy, "until you're barely more than a ghost, haunting the castle's corridors, existing but not living, surviving but not thriving. What is that but another kind of prison, another form of chains?" "The scars," he said even more gently, as if reading the pain written across her face in the way her features tightened. and her breathing became shallow. May I see them properly? No. The word came out sharper than she'd intended, born of years of hiding, years of shame, years of believing that her disfigurement made her unworthy of love or even acceptance. No one sees them. Not really. Not by choice. I'm not no one, Valethia. His voice carried a certainty that seemed to resonate in her bones, that made something deep inside her chest flutter with possibilities she'd long ago convinced herself to abandon. I'm someone who's been waiting 400 years for you to walk through that door. The certainty in his voice made her knees weak and her heart pound against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate to escape. Waiting for her, it was madness, impossible, the kind of romantic fantasy she'd abandoned years ago when she'd finally accepted that love was not meant for creatures like herself, that the best she could hope for was to be useful enough to be tolerated. And yet, there was something about the way he looked at her, something about the intensity of his focus and the warmth in his otherworldly eyes that made her feel like the most important person in the world. She'd spent so long being invisible, so many years perfecting the art of taking up as little space as possible, that being truly seen, really genuinely perceived and valued as an individual was almost overwhelming. Show me, he said again, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying more power than if he'd shouted. Please. The sounds echoing through the castle corridors that night were just the beginning. Something in his tone, in the way he asked rather than demanded, in the complete absence of the curiosity-driven cruelty she'd learned to expect from others, made her consider his request seriously for the first time in years. Before she could think better of it, before her fear and shame could override the strange compulsion his words had created in her chest, Valethia slowly pushed back the dark hair that she'd trained to fall across the left side of her face like a curtain. The 3 scars were revealed in the chamber's warm, golden light, jagged lines that had never healed properly, that had left her face forever marked and changed in the eyes of everyone who saw her. The raised flesh caught the firelight, making the twisted patterns more visible than they would have been in ordinary daylight. She waited for his expression to change, for the familiar look of disgust or pity to replace the admiration she'd seen there. She waited for him to turn away, to realize his mistake, to understand that she was exactly what everyone had always said she was: ugly, damaged, unworthy of love or even basic human kindness. Instead, Nocturnus was silent for so long that she began to lower her hair again, preparing to restore her protective barrier and retreat back into the familiar safety of hiddenness. But then he spoke, and his words changed everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. Magnificent, he breathed, his voice filled with a wonder that seemed to come from the deepest part of his immortal soul. Absolutely magnificent, more beautiful than I dared hope, more perfect than the prophecies ever described. Valethia's scars weren't accidental, and when she learned this, it would be too late. You're lying, Valethia whispered, but her hand had stilled, no longer trying to hide her face. The certainty in his voice was so absolute, so genuine, that it cut through years of accumulated shame like a blade through silk. I never lie about beauty, Nocturnus said, rising from his chair and moving as close as his chains would allow, perhaps 3 feet from where she sat, close enough that she could see the otherworldly quality of his skin in detail. This near, she could see that his pale complexion held a pearl-like luminescence that had nothing to do with the firelight dancing in the chamber. His eyes contained flecks of gold and silver that seemed to shift and move like living things. And when he breathed, she caught his scent, not the mustiness she'd expected from a long-term prisoner, but something like midnight air and starlight and deep forest secrets. In my world, in my time, he continued softly, his chained hands gesturing toward her face with reverent care. Scars like yours were marks of prophecy. They were signs that marked the chosen ones, the bridge builders between realms, the souls destined for greatness beyond mortal understanding. Your world? The words escaped as barely more than breath. I am the last prince of the Umbral court, Nocturnus said, and as he spoke the words, the very air in the chamber seemed to thicken with power that made her skin prickle and her heart race. We were the royal family of the Shadow Realm, rulers of the space between light and dark, life and death, dream and waking. For millennia beyond counting, we maintained the balance between all things, ensuring that no force grew so powerful it could destroy the delicate equilibrium that keeps existence itself stable. Valethea's mind reeled at the implications of what he was telling her. Shadow Realm, royal family, prophecies and chosen ones. It sounded like something from the fairy tales her mother had told her as a child, stories of magic kingdoms and enchanted princes that had seemed beautiful and impossible from the safety of her family's cottage hearth. And you believe, she couldn't even finish the sentence. The implications were too vast, too incredible, to even voice aloud. You bear the marks of our lost royal seal, Nocturnus said, his garnered eyes tracing the lines of her scars with something that looked almost like reverence. 3 lines that form the ancient symbol of the bridge between worlds, carved into your very flesh by powers beyond mortal comprehension. In our court, those marks would identify you as royalty of the highest order, not born to rule through accident of birth, but chosen by fate itself to unite what has been divided. She laughed, a sound bitter with years of rejection and cruelty, sharp with the accumulated pain of believing herself worthless. That's impossible. I'm the daughter of a grain merchant who died in a house fire. I got these scars when burning timber fell on me, not from some mystical prophecy. I'm nobody special. I'm less than nobody. I'm a scarred servant girl who empties chamber pots and scrubs floors and exists only at the sufferance of people who wish I would disappear entirely. Are you? His garnet eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as if he could see not just her physical form, but her very soul laid bare. Tell me about that fire, Valethia. Tell me what you truly remember, not what you've been told to remember by people who needed a simple explanation for something far too complex for their understanding. The request seemed simple enough, but as she reached for the memory of that terrible night, she realized how strange it was that she'd never really examined it closely before this moment. She'd always accepted the villager's explanation without question. Lightning strike during a storm, house fire, tragic accident that claimed her parents' lives and left her marked for life. But as she let herself truly remember for the first time in years, details emerged that had never quite made sense, pieces of the puzzle that had never fit together properly. I was 12, she began slowly, her voice growing stronger as the memory crystallized with startling clarity. There was a storm, yes, but not the kind that brings lightning and rain. This was something else entirely. The air felt thick and alive, almost breathing, and the shadows moved in ways that didn't match the wind patterns. The very darkness seemed to have substance and weight. Nocturnus had gone very still, his breathing so quiet she could barely detect the rise and fall of his chest. I remember my mother screaming, Valethia continued, the words coming faster now, as suppressed memories surfaced like bubbles rising in still water, but not from fear of fire or falling timber. She was screaming words I didn't understand, in a language I'd never heard her speak before, something that sounded ancient and powerful and desperate. My father was trying to pull me toward the door, but something was holding me back, not falling timber or burning debris, something with hands. The memory was becoming clearer now, more vivid and detailed than it had ever been before. She could see that night, as if it were happening again, in front of her, could smell the strange scents that had filled the air, not wood smoke, but something like burning roses and midnight jasmine. I remember looking up and seeing a man I'd never seen before in my life, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Tall, dark-haired, with eyes exactly like yours, but she shuddered as the memory sharpened. Cold, so terribly, impossibly cold, like looking into the heart of winter itself. He grabbed me, held me in flames that weren't really flames at all, but something else entirely. And when I tried to scream, he pressed his hand against my face. She touched her scars unconsciously, tracing the familiar lines with her fingertips as the memory continued to unfold. That's when I felt the burning, the tearing sensation that left these marks, but it wasn't from fire or heat. It was from his touch, from whatever power flowed through his fingers into my skin. He was saying something while he heard me, words in that same strange language my mother had been speaking, like he was casting some kind of spell or curse. And afterward, Nocturnus prompted gently, though his voice carried an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Afterward, when they found me in the ruins and everyone was asking what happened, the memories seemed fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream after waking up, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The details kept slipping away, and eventually I started believing what everyone told me must have happened instead of what I actually remembered. "Describe this man in more detail," Nocturnus said, and there was something in his voice that made the air in the chamber feel charged with dangerous energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. "He looked like you," she admitted reluctantly, the words feeling heavy and significant as they left her lips. "Not exactly the same, but similar enough that seeing you now brought the memory back more clearly than it's ever been before. Same height, same build, same dark hair falling to his shoulders. But where you seem warm, despite your pale skin, he was like winter made flesh and given human form. His eyes were the exact color of yours, that deep garnet red, but they held no kindness, no humanity at all. Looking into them was like staring into an empty grave, like peering into the void between stars." "Malika," Nocturnus whispered, and the name seemed to darken the very air around them, making the warm fire in the grate flicker and nearly die. When he spoke that single word, the temperature in the chamber dropped noticeably, frost beginning to form on the windows despite the mild autumn weather outside. The word hit her like a physical blow, carrying with it implications she was only beginning to understand. "Your brother burned me? But why would he? How could he possibly?" "Because you are the prophesied one," Nocturnus said, his voice heavy with centuries of pain and regret and accumulated sorrow. "The bridge between our realm and yours, the soul chosen by fate itself to unite the Shadow Court with the world of mortals. The prophecy foretold your coming centuries before your birth, described the marks you would bear, predicted the power that would awaken within you when the time was right, and the stars aligned properly." Valetia felt her legs give out entirely, and she sank to her knees on the rich Persian rug that covered the chamber floor. The elegant pattern seemed to shift and move beneath her, showing scenes of shadow and light dancing together in perfect harmony. "This is madness. I'm nobody. I have no power. I can barely manage to get through each day without breaking something, or saying something wrong, or disappointing someone who depends on me. I'm not a bridge between worlds. I'm barely capable of bridging the gap between the kitchen and the dining hall without causing some kind of incident." "You are everything," Nocturnus said fiercely, straining against his chains as if he could reach her through sheer force of will and determination. The silver links cut into his wrists, drawing drops of blood that gleamed like liquid mercury in the firelight. "You are the reason I've been imprisoned in this tower for 4 centuries, held in place by holy wards and blessed silver until the prophecy could unfold according to the ancient patterns. You are the reason I've endured endless solitude, endless waiting, endless hope that someday you would come to me and we could fulfill our destiny together." When the prince broke his chains, Valetia would discover her true identity. "But why imprisonment?" she asked, looking up at him through tears she hadn't realized were falling, salt water tracing paths down her scarred cheeks. "If I'm so important to your people, if I'm truly this prophesied bridge builder you speak of, why aren't you free to find me, to help me, to teach me about these supposed powers I meant to have?" "Because the prophecy was known to more than just the Emerald Court," Nocturnus explained, settling back into his chair, as if the intensity of their conversation had drained some of his supernatural energy. "The Church of the Sacred Light learn of it through their own oracles and seers, their own visions of the future. They understood that the union of shadow and light, the bridging of realms, would fundamentally change the balance of power in both worlds." He gestured around the elegantly appointed chamber with its fine furniture and extensive library. "They couldn't kill me outright. Destroying a prince of the Shadow Realm would have triggered a war that would have consumed both realms in darkness and flame. leaving nothing but ash and regret in its wake. Instead, they chose a more subtle form of imprisonment, a prison that would contain me without provoking the kind of retaliation that would destroy everything they were trying to protect. These chains are forged from blessed silver, he continued, raising his wrist so she could see the delicate but unbreakable links more clearly, inscribed with holy words that prevent me from using most of my abilities, that keep me bound to this chamber like a bird with clipped wings. The tower itself sits on a convergence of ley lines that they've corrupted with sacred symbols and holy relics, making it impossible for me to escape or even communicate with my own people. But they didn't just imprison me randomly or out of simple fear, he said, his voice growing darker with each word. Their prophet had a vision of the future. He saw that I would be the one to recognize you when you finally appeared, the one capable of awakening your true nature and helping you fulfill the prophecy that would change everything. So they kept me here, like a caged wolf, waiting for the right moment, knowing that eventually fate would bring you to me. Valethia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to process the enormity of what he was telling her. Prophecies and shadow courts, holy wars, and imprisoned princes. It was like something from the most elaborate fairy tale ever conceived, except that it was apparently her life, her reality, her destiny unfolding before her in ways she'd never imagined possible. And your brother? She asked, reading the answer, but needing to understand. Where does Melekar fit into all of this? What did he hope to accomplish by marking me the way he did? Melekar was always the ambitious one, Nocturnus said, pain flickering across his perfect features, like shadows cast by flickering candlelight. Where I saw the prophecy as a chance to unite our peoples, to bring balance and harmony between the realms, and create something beautiful from the division that had existed for millennia. He saw it as an opportunity for conquest and domination. The fire in the grate crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney, as if responding to the tension in the chamber. He believed that if he could corrupt the bridge builder before she came into her full power, before she understood her true nature and potential, he could twist the prophecy to serve his own ends. Instead of uniting the realms in harmony, he planned to use the bridge to invade and conquer, making himself the ruler of all worlds rather than their protector and guardian. The pieces were beginning to form a horrible picture in Valethia's mind, a tapestry of manipulation and suffering that stretched back to her childhood. So he found me when I was 12 years old and marked me with what exactly? Some kind of dark magic, not just any dark magic, Nocturnus said grimly, his garnet eyes reflecting the firelight in ways that made them seem to burn with inner flame. The scars he gave you aren't just marks of prophecy, they're also conduits for corruption. Every moment of suffering you've endured since that night, every tear you've shed, every time you felt worthless or unloved or invisible, all of that pain has been feeding the dark seed he planted in your soul, growing stronger with each passing year, waiting for the day when you would come into your full power. Horror crept up her spine like ice water, making her shiver despite the chamber's warmth. You're saying that all these years of misery, all the loneliness and shame and rejection I've endured, that was intentional? That your brother somehow orchestrated my entire life to maximize my suffering? Not orchestrated precisely, Nocturnus said carefully, choosing his words with obvious precision. He couldn't control every detail of your mortal existence. The prophecy itself is too strong for that level of manipulation, and free will is a force that even the most powerful magic cannot completely override. But he influenced things, nudged events in certain directions, ensured that you would never find the love and acceptance that might have allowed you to discover your true nature too early. Valethia felt physically sick, her stomach churning with a mixture of rage and despair that threatened to overwhelm her completely. 7 years of believing herself worthless, 7 years of invisible existence in the castle, 7 years of careful self-hatred and practiced self-denial, all of it part of some cosmic manipulation by a creature she'd met only once, in childhood, during the worst night of her life. But there's something Melekar didn't anticipate, Nocturnus continued, and for the first time since she'd entered the chamber, she heard genuine hope in his voice. something he couldn't account for in all his careful planning and manipulation. What? The prophecy is stronger than his corruption, he said, his eyes beginning to glow with silver light that had nothing to do with the fire. The moment you walked through that door, the moment you allowed me to see your true face without hiding behind your hair or your shame, the balance began to shift in our favor. Your presence here is already beginning to weaken his hold over you, to awaken the power that has always been yours by right. How can you tell? He smiled, and the expression transformed his already beautiful face into something that took her breath away entirely. Because you're glowing. Valethia looked down at herself and gasped in amazement and terror. A faint silver light was indeed emanating from her skin, so subtle she wouldn't have noticed it under normal circumstances, but unmistakable here in the warm golden light of the chamber. The luminescence seemed strongest around her scars, making the raised lines look less like disfigurements and more like jewelry, like the kind of elegant filigree work that might adorn a queen's crown. The awakening has begun, Nocturnus said softly, his voice filled with wonder and relief, and something that might have been love. But we don't have much time before Malakar realizes what's happening. You will have felt the shift in the magical currents that run through both worlds. He'll know that you found me, that the prophecy is beginning to unfold according to its original design, rather than his corrupted version. And when he realizes that his centuries of careful planning are starting to unravel, he'll come for me, Valethia finished, understanding flooding through her like cold water. He'll come for both of us, Nocturnus corrected grimly. And when he does, we need to be ready. But the real heartbreak would come when the royal secrets were revealed. The silver light emanating from Valethia's skin grew stronger as she stared at her hands in amazement, watching the luminescence pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. The scars on her face began to tingle, not with pain, but with a warm, welcoming sensation, like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the wilderness. What's happening to me? She whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before, notes that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the merely physical. You're becoming who you were always meant to be, Nocturnus said, moving as close to her as his chains allowed. The mortal guise you've worn for 19 years is beginning to fall away, revealing your true nature underneath. As if his words were a catalyst, the transformation began to accelerate. The plain servant's dress she wore started to shimmer and change, the rough brown fabric becoming something that looked like it was woven from moonbeams and starlight. Her dark hair, which had always been fine and unremarkable, began to gleam with silver highlights that caught the firelight in impossible ways. I remember, she breathed, and suddenly she did. Memories that didn't belong to her life, as Valethia, the servant, began flooding through her consciousness like a river, bursting its banks. She saw herself in flowing gowns of midnight silk, standing beside Nocturnus on a throne that seemed to be carved from crystallized starlight. She saw vast halls where shadow and light danced together in perfect harmony, where creatures of every realm paid homage to their united rulers. She remembered being loved, truly loved, with a passion that transcended death itself. She remembered Nocturnus as he had been before his imprisonment, free and powerful and radiant, his laugh filling their palace with joy, his touch setting her soul ablaze with happiness she'd never known in her mortal existence. Seraphina, Nocturnus whispered, and the name resonated through her being like a bell struck in a cathedral, awakening parts of herself that had slept for decades. Your true name, do you remember it now? Seraphina Ambrorix, she said, and speaking the words aloud felt like claiming a birthright she'd been denied her entire life. Queen of the Shadow Court and keeper of the balance. The memories were overwhelming. Centuries of existence, compressed into moments of revelation. She remembered the prophecy that had brought them together initially, spoken by the oracle of between spaces, in words that had resonated across multiple dimensions. When shadow meets light in a soul marked by flame, when the bridge builder wakes to reclaim her true name, the realms shall unite under love's sacred seal, and what was broken shall finally heal. But beware the dark brother who twists prophecy's thread, for his corruption brings nothing but sorrow and dread. Only through sacrifice, freely given in love's pure fire, can the bridge between worlds fulfill its desire. But even as joy flooded through her at this reunion with her true identity, even as she felt power awakening in her blood, like music made manifest, a terrible realization was growing in her consciousness. The prophecy, she said, the words heavy with dread. I remember it now, all of it, including the parts we both tried to forget. What exactly does it mean by sacrifice, freely given in love's pure fire? The silver light in Nocturnus's eyes dimmed, and she saw the shadow of truth he'd been hoping to postpone indefinitely. The bridge between realms can only be anchored by the ultimate act of love, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 4 centuries of dreading this moment. One of us must surrender their immortal essence to stabilize the connection, to ensure that the united realms remain in harmony rather than tearing each other apart through incompatible magical forces. One of us must die, she said, the words falling into the chamber like stones into still water, creating ripples of despair that seemed to reach into every corner of the space. Not die exactly, he said carefully, but she could hear the pain he was trying to hide behind precise language. Transformation, the one who makes the sacrifice, becomes part of the bridge itself. Their consciousness woven into the fabric of reality between the realms. They would exist, in a sense, but not as an individual being capable of love or joy or personal fulfillment. They would become the living embodiment of the connection between worlds, aware but not truly alive. The silver fire that had been building around Seraphina flickered and dimmed as the implications of his words sank in. And you've known this all along. For 400 years, you've been planning for one of us to stop existing as an individual. I've spent 4 centuries trying to find another way, he said desperately, his chains rattling as he strained against them. I've studied every text in this library, consulted with every oracle who would speak to me through dreams and visions, searched through every prophecy and legend and scrap of magical knowledge I could access, looking for some alternative interpretation, some loophole that would allow us both to survive. She pulled back from him, the transformation halting mid-process. She was caught between states now, not fully the simple servant she had been, but not yet the supernatural queen she was meant to become. So all of this, she said, her voice hollow with betrayal, all these feelings, this connection between us, the love I can feel growing in my chest, despite everything that's happened, it's all just leading to one of us ceasing to exist as an individual? What kind of love story is that? The truest kind, Nocturnus said, pain written across every line of his perfect face. The kind that puts the beloved's happiness and continued existence above one's own desires. The kind that recognizes that some things are more important than personal fulfillment. He leaned forward, as much as his chains would allow, his garnet eyes pleading with her to understand. I had hoped, I had planned to be the one to make the sacrifice. You would rule the united realms with wisdom and compassion, and I would find peace knowing that our peoples were safe, that the balance was maintained, that you were free to become everything you were meant to be. But now that I've seen you again, now that I've held your hand and felt our connection fully restored, now that I remember what it means to love you. His voice broke entirely. I don't know if I have the strength to leave you again, not when we've just found each other after so many centuries of separation and longing. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind howling through the tower's heights. Seraphina stared at her hands, watching the silver light flicker uncertainly around her fingers like candle flames in a gentle breeze, and tried to process the cosmic cruelty of their situation. To save both her peoples, to fulfill her destiny and unite the realms in harmony rather than allowing them to remain divided and vulnerable, she had to choose which of them would cease to exist as an individual. The prophecy offered no guidance about how to make such an impossible decision. It simply stated that the sacrifice must be made freely, out of love, rather than duty or obligation. There has to be another way, she said finally, standing and beginning to pace the chamber. Despite the limitations imposed by his chains, prophecies can be interpreted differently, can't they? Maybe the sacrifice doesn't mean what we think it means. I've considered every possible interpretation, Nocturnus replied, watching her movement with eyes that held centuries of accumulated hope and despair. I've spent decades analyzing every word, every phrase, every possible alternative meaning. But magic, particularly prophetic magic, that deals with fundamental forces of reality, tends to be frustratingly literal in its requirements. The words mean what they appear to mean. Then we don't fulfill the prophecy, she said with sudden fierce determination, turning to face him directly. We find a way to break free from this cosmic script, to choose our own destiny, instead of following some fate written by powers we've never even met. He looked at her with an expression that mixed hope with gentle skepticism. The prophecy isn't just a prediction of future events. Seraphina, it's woven into the fundamental structure of both our realms, written into the very laws that govern magic and reality. Trying to avoid it would be like trying to avoid gravity or the passage of time, possible in small ways, for short periods, but ultimately futile. Maybe futile for a servant girl and an imprisoned prince, she said, feeling power beginning to build in her voice again, silver light flowing around her like liquid starlight. But what about a queen of shadows and her prince consort? What about two people who refused to accept that love must always end in loss? Before he could respond to her challenge, the temperature in the chamber plummeted so rapidly that their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. Frost began forming on the windows, despite the warm fire in the grate, and the flames themselves turned from golden orange to an ominous blue-white color. He comes, Nocturnus said, his chains beginning to glow with a red light that contrasted sharply with their usual silver gleam. My brother, he's felt the awakening of your power, the restoration of your memories, the beginning of your transformation into your true self. Malachar is coming for you, and when he arrives, everything will change. The chamber door, which had been standing partially open since her arrival, suddenly slammed shut with a sound like thunder. The locks that had been open when she'd arrived turned themselves with audible clicks, sealing them inside. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, trapped in a tower room with nowhere to run and no way to call for help. What do we do? Seraphina asked, silver fire beginning to build around her hands as instincts she didn't know she possessed awakened in response to the approaching threat. We remember who we are, Nocturnus said, his voice carrying a strength and authority that she hadn't heard before. We remember what we're fighting for, and we pray that love really is stronger than corruption, that the bond between us can overcome centuries of careful manipulation and malice. The very air in the chamber began to vibrate with approaching power, dark energy that made her newly awakened abilities respond with defensive preparations she didn't consciously understand. Whatever was coming through that locked door would be unlike anything her mortal existence had prepared her to face. But she was no longer merely mortal, and the man chained beside her was far more than just a prisoner. They were ancient powers, awakening, cosmic forces preparing for a confrontation that had been building for centuries. The real battle for her soul was about to begin. The chamber door exploded inward with a sound like thunder combined with the screaming of tortured metal, sending splinters of ancient oak flying across the room like wooden daggers. The figure that strode through the destroyed entrance was both terrifyingly familiar and utterly alien, a nightmare made flesh that carried the scent of winter roses and burning midnight. Melekar shared his brother's perfect bone structure and supernatural grace, but where Nocturnus radiated warmth despite his pale complexion, this newcomer seemed to absorb light and heat from everything around him. He was tall and darkly handsome, dressed in elegant black clothing that looked like it had been tailored in the finest shops of Paris or London, but the fabric seemed to move and shift on its own, as if it were woven from living shadow and malevolent intention. His eyes were the same deep garnet color as Nocturnus's, but where the imprisoned prince's gaze held depths of kindness and ancient wisdom, Malakar's eyes were like looking into twin abysses, beautiful, mesmerizing, and utterly without compassion or mercy. When he smiled, his teeth were too white, too sharp, too perfect for any creature that had ever known human limitation. Dear brother, Malakar said, his voice carrying the same cultured accent as Nocturnus, but tinged with mockery and centuries of accumulated malice. Still playing with your food, I see. Though I must admit, our little queen has developed quite beautifully since I last had the pleasure of her company. Seraphina scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go in the confines of the chamber. The window was behind her, offering only a deadly drop to the ravine below, and Melekar blocked the destroyed doorway with his imposing presence. His cold, garnered eyes fixed on her with predatory hunger that made her feel like a mouse caught in the gaze of a serpent. "And you, my lovely little queen," he continued, moving with the fluid grace of a predator stalking wounded prey, each step deliberate and calculated. "How magnificently you've grown into your suffering, still bearing my marks so perfectly after all these years. I see you," she whispered, and her voice carried both her mortal terror and her newly awakened power. The silver light around her flared brighter, responding to the threat his presence represented. "You did this to me. You destroyed my family, stole my childhood, condemned me to years of isolation and shame and self-hatred. I gave you purpose," Melekart corrected, circling closer like a wolf, testing the defenses of its prey. The very air around him seemed to darken and corrupt, making the chamber's warm firelight flicker and dim. Frost spread outward from his footsteps, covering the beautiful Persian rugs with crystalline ice. "I gave you the strength that can only come from enduring true pain, the power that grows from surviving what should have destroyed you completely." His smile was terrible to behold, beautiful and cruel in equal measure. "Did my brother tell you the full truth about that night 12 years ago? About why I marked you the way I did? About what I was really accomplishing while your parents screamed and died around us?" Nocturnus strained against his chains with such force that the blessed silver cut deep into his wrists, drawing drops of blood that gleamed like liquid mercury in the chamber's shifting light. "Stay away from her, Melek. The prophecy has already begun its fulfillment according to the original design. She bears the true royal seal now, not your corruption." "Does she?" Melethia laughed, the sound like breaking glass mixed with winter wind, like the death screams of everything beautiful and innocent in the world. "Look more closely, dear brother. Look at what I really accomplished that night, what I truly carved into her very essence, with fire and pain and exquisite precision." He gestured towards Seraphina with one elegant hand, and suddenly she could see herself as the brothers saw her, not just the physical scars on her face, but the deeper marks burned into her very soul. The lines weren't random damage from fire or falling timber, as she'd been told. They were symbols, ancient runes that pulsed with dark energy, forming a pattern that made her stomach turn with recognition and growing horror. The scars spelled out words in the old language, words that roughly translated to "marked for darkness" and "claimed by shadow and vessel of vengeance." Every curve and line had been deliberately placed, carefully carved to create a binding that would grow stronger with each passing year of suffering. "I didn't just mark her for the prophecy," Melekar said, his voice rich with satisfaction at her growing understanding. "I marked her as mine, body and soul and spirit. Every moment of suffering she's endured since that night, every tear she's shed in loneliness and despair, every time she's cried herself to sleep, believing she was worthless and unloved. All of it has been feeding the corruption I planted in her essence, growing stronger and more deeply rooted with each passing day." Seraphina felt something cold and terrible unfurling inside her chest, like a poisonous flower blooming in her heart. The power she'd felt awakening wasn't entirely the noble force she'd imagined. There was darkness there too, a hungry shadow that had nothing to do with Nocturnus's gentle twilight realm, and everything to do with pain and vengeance, and the intoxicating satisfaction of making others hurt as she had been hurt. "You're lying," she said, but her voice shook with growing uncertainty as she felt the darkness responding to his words, growing stronger in her chest like a living thing that had been waiting years to be acknowledged. "Am I? Then tell me, my dear sweet queen," Malaka said, moving close enough that she could feel the unnatural cold radiating from his skin. "In all your years of suffering, in all those moments when the other servants mocked you or the nobles looked through you as if you didn't exist? Didn't you ever fantasize about revenge? Didn't you ever imagine what it would be like to make them pay for every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every moment they made you feel small and worthless and invisible? The terrible thing was that he was absolutely right. In the darkest hours of her loneliest nights, she had imagined such things with vivid, guilty pleasure. She'd pictured herself with power, with beauty, with the ability to force those who had hurt her to feel the same pain they'd inflicted on her, without thought or mercy. She'd fantasized about watching the other servants grovel before her, about seeing fear replace contempt in the eyes of nobles who had looked through her as if she were furniture. She'd imagined Lady Ravenclaw begging for forgiveness, Gertrude trembling with terror, all the cruel children who had made games of her suffering, crying with the same hopeless despair she'd carried for years. Those thoughts, those desires for vengeance and retribution, Melekar continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper that seemed to speak directly to the darkness growing in her soul. They weren't weakness or moral failing, my dear. They were strength. They were the corruption I planted in you, growing stronger, preparing you to become something far greater and more terrible than my brother ever imagined possible. She can still choose, Nocturnus said desperately, his voice carrying both love and fear in equal measure. Blood ran freely from his wrists now as he fought against the chains that bound him. The marks may influence her, but they cannot control her completely. Free will exists even in the face of the strongest magic. Seraphina, you must decide for yourself what you want to become, who you want to be in this moment when everything hangs in the balance. Choose. Malethia's laughter filled the chamber like poisonous smoke, like the sound of hope dying and dreams turning to ash. Look at her brother. Really look at what 7 years of believing herself worthless has accomplished. She's already more mine than yours. The darkness has been growing in her heart all this time, fed by every cruel word, every rejection, every moment she wished she could simply disappear from a world that had no place for her. And he was right. Seraphina realized with growing horror that felt like drowning in ice water. There was darkness in her, deep and hungry and vast. Years of pain had carved out hollows inside her soul that now pulled at everything around them, seeking to fill themselves with power and revenge and the sweet satisfaction of being feared instead of pitied. The silver light that had been growing around her began to flicker and dim as the darkness responded to Melekar's words, as the corruption he planted years ago finally began to bear its intended fruit. She could feel herself changing, becoming something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous than the servant girl who had climbed the tower stairs that morning. But there was something else too, something that had awakened the moment Nocturnus first called her beautiful, first looked at her scars with admiration instead of revulsion, light to balance the darkness, love to counter the hate, the gentle warmth of acceptance to oppose the cold fire of vengeance. She stood in the center of the chamber, positioned between the two brothers, like a fulcrum on which the fate of multiple worlds balanced. The marks in her soul pulsed with competing energies, dark and light, shadow and silver, corruption and purity, all swirling together in a pattern that was uniquely, completely hers. "You're both wrong," she said, her voice growing stronger as she found her center between the competing forces. "You're both trying to make me choose between extremes, as if I have to be either pure light or consuming darkness, either perfect victim or terrible monster. But I'm not just one thing, and I refuse to pretend otherwise." Power began to build around her like a visible aura, silver and shadow intertwining in patterns that had never existed before in any realm. The scars on her face blazed with every color of light and darkness combined, and she felt herself transforming not into the queen of any single realm, but into something that transcended all existing boundaries and definitions. "I choose to be both," she declared, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through multiple dimensions simultaneously. "I choose to acknowledge the darkness that pain created in me without being consumed by it. I choose to embrace the light that love offered me without pretending the shadows don't exist or don't have value in their own right." Impossible, Malekaz snarled, but his voice carried uncertainty now instead of absolute confidence. The darkness, he commanded, seemed sluggish and confused, unsure how to respond to this new energy that contained elements of both light and shadow, but was defined by neither. Magnificent, Nocturnus breathed, and as he spoke the word with wonder and love and profound relief, his chains began to crack and splinter. The blessed Silver, unable to contain the new power she was generating. I choose to sacrifice neither light nor shadow, Seraphina continued, power flowing around her in visible waves that made the very air shimmer with possibility. Instead, I sacrifice the illusion that they must be enemies, the belief that love requires the destruction of one side or the other, the assumption that strength comes from purity rather than from integration. The chamber began to shake, as reality itself struggled to accommodate what she was becoming. She was no longer just the prophesied bridge between light and shadow. She was becoming something entirely new, a force that contained multitudes without being limited by any single definition or expectation. This isn't how the prophecy was meant to unfold, Malaika said, genuine uncertainty creeping into his voice, for the first time since he'd entered the chamber. Perhaps, Seraphina replied, her transformed voice carrying notes of music and starlight and deep earth wisdom. The prophecy was never about choosing between light and shadow at all. Perhaps it was always about proving that apparent opposites could coexist, could strengthen each other instead of destroying each other, could create something beautiful and new from the tension between them. The power radiating from her began to affect both brothers in unexpected ways. Nocturnus's chains dissolved entirely, the blessed Silver unable to contain or channel the new energy she was creating. But Malaka's shadows also began to shift and change, losing their sharp edges of malice and becoming softer, more complex, more capable of existing alongside light instead of simply consuming it. I offer you each the same choice, she said, extending one hand toward each brother, silver fire dancing around one palm while gentle shadows coiled around the other. Continue your eternal war, fighting over which of you will rule which realm, which of you will possess which souls, which vision of the future will dominate. Or help me build something entirely new, a space where light and shadow dance together instead of battling, where creatures of all natures can find belonging, where love doesn't require the destruction of anything that seems different or threatening. Nocturnus didn't hesitate for even a moment. He took her offered hand immediately, and she felt his essence joining with hers, his nobility tempering her humiliated pain, his gentleness balancing her capacity for vengeance, his centuries of wisdom guiding her newly awakened power. Together they were something greater than either could have been alone. Malalthea stood frozen at the edge of the circle of power they were creating, staring at the energy flowing between them. For a moment that stretched across eternity, everything balanced on the edge of his decision. She could see the war raging behind his garnet eyes, centuries of hurt and anger and twisted love, warring with the possibility of redemption, of belonging, of being more than the sum of his worst impulses and darkest choices. You offer me forgiveness? He asked finally, his voice smaller and more vulnerable than she'd ever heard it, like a child asking if there was still a place at the table after years of being told they weren't welcome. After everything I've done to you, to him, to countless others, across the centuries, after all the pain I've caused in service of my own ambition and wounded pride, I offer you the same thing I'm offering myself, Seraphina replied, her voice carrying infinite compassion without sacrificing any of its strength. The chance to be more than your worst impulses, to build something beautiful from the ruins of what you've destroyed, to discover that redemption is always possible for those willing to choose it freely. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of cosmic decision. She could feel the very fabric of reality holding its breath, waiting to see which direction the future would turn based on this single moment of choice. Then, with a sound like winter breaking into spring, like the first ray of sunlight after the longest night, like hope being born from the ashes of despair, Maleka reached out and took her other hand. The explosion of power that followed reshaped reality itself. When the light faded, and the dimensions settled into their new configuration. The chamber in the east tower was gone. The entire castle had vanished along with it. The narrow bridge, the rocky ravine, the medieval stones that had housed centuries of human drama and supernatural intrigue. In their place stood something that had never existed before in any realm or dimension. A palace that existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously until stretched before them. Its architecture defying conventional understanding of space and physics. Walls that seemed to be built from crystallized moonlight, supported ceilings that showed not the sky of any single world, but the combined heavens of every realm that had ever existed. Gardens bloomed with flowers that grew in sunlight and shadows simultaneously, their petals shifting between every color that had ever been imagined or dreamed. Rivers of liquid starlight flowed through corridors that stretched into infinity, carrying the whispered hopes and dreams of every soul in every world that had ever yearned for something better. Bridges of solidified music spanned chasms that revealed glimpses of other dimensions, other realities, other versions of existence, where different choices had led to different outcomes. Seraphina stood at the heart of it all, no longer fully human, but something infinitely more complex and beautiful. Her servant's dress had been replaced by robes that seemed to be woven from aurora borealis and twilight mist, fabric that shifted and flowed with her movements like living light. The scars that had marked her as an outcast now blazed as a crown of living constellations, each line containing entire galaxies of possibility and power. Beings from every realm began to appear in the palace's vast halls, creatures of pure light who had never known shadow dwellers who had never experienced illumination, and everything in between. They looked upon her not with the disgust or pity she'd grown accustomed to in her mortal existence, but with wonder and reverence and gratitude. The scarred queen, they began to whisper, though the title was spoken with awe now rather than mockery. The bridge builder, the one who united what was divided, the keeper of sacred balance, the mother of integration. Nocturnus stood at her right hand, transformed as well, but retaining his essential nature. The chains that had bound him for 4 centuries had become threads of silver light that connected him to every soul in need of protection throughout all the realms. He had become not just a prince of shadows, but a guardian of the liminal spaces where different realities touched and blended. His role was to protect those who existed in the spaces between definitions, beings who were neither fully one thing nor another, souls who had been rejected by conventional categories, creatures who needed a place to belong despite not fitting into any existing framework of understanding. Malekor had perhaps changed most of all. The corruption that had driven him to cruelty for so many centuries had been burned away by the new magic Seraphina had created, leaving something raw and uncertain, but capable of tremendous growth and transformation. The malice that had defined him was gone, replaced by a deep well of remorse that was slowly being filled with the possibility of redemption. He knelt before Seraphina, not in submission, but in gratitude, and accepted the role she offered him, not as a prince of darkness, spreading corruption and fear, but as a guide for those who carried shadows in their hearts and needed to learn that darkness didn't necessarily mean evil, that pain could be transformed into compassion, that even the worst choices could be redeemed through genuine remorse and dedicated service. His new domain would be the realm of second chances, the space where souls who had lost their way could find new paths forward, where those who had been defined by their worst moments could discover that they were capable of so much more. Is this truly how the prophecy was meant to unfold? Nocturnus asked, as they stood together watching their new realm take shape around them, watching former enemies discover they could be friends, watching impossible loves bloom between beings who had never imagined they could coexist. The prophecy spoke of sacrifice, Seraphina replied, her voice carrying the music of wind through autumn leaves and waves against distant shores. But not the kind of sacrifice we expected. We didn't sacrifice our lives, or our love, or our individual existence. We sacrificed our limitations. She gestured toward the incredible vista spreading before them. Gardens where creatures of flame danced with beings of ice, libraries where scholars from every dimension shared knowledge across previously impossible barriers, healing answers where those wounded by prejudice and hatred learned to find wholeness again. We gave up the belief that we had to be only one thing, that love had to mean loss, that bringing different worlds together would result in destruction rather than creation. We sacrificed our preconceptions about what was possible. And the cost? Malakot asked quietly, still adjusting to his new role, still learning to trust in the possibility of redemption and positive change. Seraphina considered the question as she watched a group of shadow creatures play with beings made of pure light, their laughter creating new constellations in the impossible sky above them. She observed former enemies sharing meals and stories, learning that their differences made them stronger rather than weaker when they chose cooperation over conflict. She saw creatures who had been rejected by their original realms for being too different, too mixed, too complicated to fit into existing categories, finally finding a place where complexity was celebrated rather than feared. The cost was everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our world, she said finally. We had to let go of every assumption, every limitation, every fear that kept us trapped in cycles of pain and conflict. We had to be willing to become something entirely new instead of clinging to familiar patterns of suffering. Was it worth it? Malakot pressed, genuine curiosity in his voice as he watched a group of children from multiple realms playing together, their innocent joy creating ripples of healing magic that spread throughout the palace. She looked at Nocturnus, seeing the wonder and freedom in his garnet eyes, the relief of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden for centuries and had finally been allowed to set it down. She looked at Malakas, seeing the amazement of someone discovering that they could be more than the sum of their worst choices, that redemption was not only possible but actively supported by the universe itself. She looked out at their new realm, watching former enemies become friends, witnessing impossible partnerships bloom into something beautiful, observing the birth of a kind of harmony that had never existed before in any world. Ask me in a few centuries, she said with a smile that could have lit entire galaxies, but I suspect the answer will always be yes. The transformation of the East Tower and the birth of the Bridge Realm sent ripples across every dimension that existed. In the mortal world, where Seraphina had once served as a scarred outcast, the servants of Ravenclaw Castle woke to find their entire reality fundamentally changed. The castle still stood, but it was no longer the same building they had known. The cold stone walls now pulsed with gentle warmth, and windows that had once looked out on ordinary countryside now revealed glimpses of impossible vistas. Forests where autumn leaves fell upward towards star-filled skies, oceans that reflected not one sun, but dozens of different colored stars, mountains that sang with voices like crystal bells. Where the East Tower had once stood in isolation, connected by a treacherous bridge over a rocky ravine, there was now a garden unlike anything that had ever existed. Trees bore fruit that glowed with inner light, providing sustenance that fed not just the body, but the soul. Flowers bloomed in colors that had no names, their fragrances carrying the power to heal old wounds and mend broken hearts. Streams of liquid music flowed through the garden, carrying melodies that helped listeners remember their truest selves and their deepest dreams. Those who drank from these streams found their own voices strengthened, their own capacity for love and creativity expanded beyond what they had thought possible. Some of the castle's servants fled in terror, convinced that devils or demons had overtaken their workplace. But others stayed, drawn by a sense of wonder and possibility they couldn't fully explain. They discovered that the work they had once done out of necessity and fear could now be performed as acts of love and service that brought genuine satisfaction. Lord Ravenclaw himself had been transformed by proximity to the great magic, not physically, but spiritually. The harsh pragmatism that had defined his rule for decades was tempered by new compassion, new understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. He found himself making decisions based not just on efficiency and profit, but on how those choices would affect the well-being and happiness of everyone in his domain. "Where is the girl?" he asked Mistress Gertrude on the first morning after the transformation, genuine concern in his voice, rather than mere curiosity about missing property. The scarred servant who was assigned to the tower, what became of her? Gertrude, who had spent the night in prayer and meditation, trying to understand what had happened to her carefully ordered world, looked up from her ledger of household accounts. The pages were different now. Instead of mere numbers and inventories, the book contained poetry and stories and recipes for healing both body and spirit. "Gone, my lord," she said carefully, "but not dead, I think. Transformed into something much greater than what she was. Something that all the cruelty in the world couldn't diminish or destroy. Into what? Something that found a way to take every pain and turn it into power," Gertrude replied, her own voice carrying new warmth and understanding, something that proved love could conquer not through violence or domination, but through acceptance and integration, and the courage to become more than anyone expected. In the days and weeks that followed, word of the transformation spread throughout the land, like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Bards composed ballads about the scarred queen who had refused to choose between light and darkness, who had instead created something entirely new from the tension between opposing forces. Scholars traveled from distant universities to study the philosophical implications of her choice, the way she had transcended the limitations of binary thinking and created space for infinite complexity and nuance. Theologians debated whether her transformation represented divine intervention, natural evolution, or something beyond either category. But it was the children who truly understood what had happened and what it meant for their world. They were the ones who still caught glimpses of the bridge realm during moments of deep imagination or profound emotion. They saw figures moving in the transformed garden, a beautiful woman whose scars had become stars, a noble man whose former chains had become ribbons of protective light, and a redeemed figure who was learning to use his knowledge of darkness to guide others toward healing. The children created new games based on the story, always ending with the same fundamental lesson, that the things that make you different, the experiences that hurt you, the aspects of yourself that others might use to make you feel worthless, all of those things could become your greatest sources of strength and wisdom if you learn to integrate them rather than simply endure them or fight against them. They learned that being different wasn't a flaw to be hidden, but a gift to be celebrated, that complexity was more valuable than simplicity, that the most beautiful things in existence were often those that contained apparent contradictions. In the transformed castle, the servants who had chosen to remain found their lives changing in ways both subtle and profound. Margaret, the kitchen maid who had once been among Seraphina's cruelest tormentors, woke one morning to find that she could no longer speak words intended to cause pain. Every time she tried to mock or belittle someone, the words would transform in her mouth into compliments or expressions of genuine concern. At first, she was frustrated and frightened by this change, feeling as though her free will had been stolen. But gradually, she began to notice how much better she felt when she spoke kindly to others, how much more beautiful the world looked when she approached it with compassion rather than criticism. Thomas, the stable boy who had thrown stones at Seraphina during her first weeks at the castle, discovered that his hands now had the power to heal any creature they touched with genuine love and intention. Injured horses mended under his care, sick dogs recovered their health, and even plants that had been damaged by frost or disease bloomed again when he tended them with patience and dedication. He became the castle's unofficial healer, sought out by anyone whose heart or body needed mending. The power didn't work when he tried to use it for personal gain or recognition. It only manifested when his desire to help others was completely sincere and selfless. Sarah, who had led the expedition to dare each other to approach the tower years ago, found that she could now see through any deception or false facade. She instantly recognized when someone was lying, when they were pretending to be something they weren't, when they were hiding pain behind cruelty or fear behind aggression. This gift was initially overwhelming. She saw how much suffering existed in the world, how many people were carrying burdens they felt they couldn't share, but she also learned to use her insight to help others, to create safe spaces where people could drop their masks and be authentic without fear of judgment or rejection. Even Gertrude, the stern head servant who had ruled the castle's domestic life with iron discipline, found herself changing. Her harsh efficiency was tempered by new understanding. Her commands became suggestions, and her criticism transformed into guidance, offered with genuine care for improvement rather than mere fault-finding. She discovered that the castle ran even more smoothly when people worked from love rather than fear, when they felt valued and appreciated rather than merely tolerated. The meals were more delicious, the rooms were cleaner, and the entire atmosphere was warmer and more welcoming than it had ever been under her previous regime of strict control. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the servants treated each other. The rigid hierarchy that had once divided them into competing factions began to dissolve. Those who had been at the bottom of the social structure, the scarred, the slow, the different, found themselves not just accepted, but actively valued for the unique perspectives their experiences had given them. They formed a new kind of community based not on conventional markers of worth, like beauty or strength or social status, but on qualities like kindness, creativity, resilience, and the ability to help others heal from their wounds. The castle became a place where broken things were mended rather than discarded, where differences were celebrated rather than merely tolerated, where everyone had something valuable to contribute, regardless of what scars they carried or what mistakes they had made in the past. As news of the transformation spread beyond the castle walls, people began arriving from all corners of the kingdom and beyond. They came seeking healing, seeking answers, seeking a place where they might belong, despite carrying wounds or differences that made them outcasts in their original communities. A young woman arrived, whose face had been burned in a fire similar to Seraphina's childhood tragedy. She had traveled for months, following rumors of a place where scars were worn as crowns, where disfigurement was seen as distinction rather than defect. In the castle's transformed gardens, she found others who bore similar marks, not physical scars necessarily, but evidence of having survived experiences that changed them fundamentally. They formed a community of mutual support and understanding, sharing their stories and learning that their survival made them stronger rather than weaker, that their visible differences were proof of their courage and resilience. A man came who had been cast out from his village for his attraction to other men, told that his love was unnatural and sinful. In the Bridge Realm's influence, he discovered that love in all its forms was celebrated and protected, that there were as many ways to love as there were stars in the sky, and all of them were valid expressions of the human heart's capacity for connection. Children who had been rejected by their families for being too sensitive, too different, too complicated to understand, found new families among the castle's residents. They learned that sensitivity was a gift rather than a weakness, that complexity was more interesting than simplicity, that being different meant having something unique and valuable to offer the world. Artists and writers and musicians who had been told their work was too strange, too dark, too unconventional, began arriving, drawn by reports of a place where all forms of creative expression were welcomed and encouraged. They found that their art became more powerful when it was created in an atmosphere of acceptance rather than judgment, when they didn't have to hide or apologize for their vision. The castle's library, which had once been a dusty repository of conventional texts, became a living collection of stories and songs and paintings that captured every possible human experience. Visitors could find themselves represented in these works, could see their own struggles and triumphs reflected back at them in ways that helped them understand they were not alone. But the influence extended beyond just providing refuge for outcasts and misfits. The transformation began to affect the surrounding countryside, slowly changing how people thought about difference and acceptance and the value of every individual soul. Villages that had once shunned anyone who didn't conform to narrow standards of normalcy began questioning those standards. Families that had rejected children for being different started reaching out, hoping to rebuild connections they had severed in ignorance and fear. The ripple effects spread further with each passing month. Neighboring kingdoms heard the stories and began examining their own practices, their own assumptions about who deserved love and acceptance and opportunity. Laws that had codified discrimination began to change. Customs that had excluded entire groups of people started evolving. It wasn't a sudden revolution. Change rarely happens that quickly or completely, but it was a steady transformation, like the way spring gradually melts winter ice, revealing the life that was always present underneath, but had been hidden by cold and hardness. Not everyone welcomed the changes that were spreading across the land. There were those who benefited from the old ways, who derived their power from the exclusion and diminishment of others. They began to organize resistance to what they saw as dangerous idealism that threatened the natural order of society. A coalition of noble families, religious authorities, and wealthy merchants formed to combat what they called the corruption of proper standards. They argued that accepting everyone regardless of their differences would lead to chaos, that hierarchies existed for good reasons, that some people were simply meant to be servants while others were born to rule. Lord Mordain, a powerful duke from a neighboring kingdom, led this resistance. He was a man who had built his wealth and influence on the labor of people he considered inferior, who maintained his position by convincing others that their suffering was natural and inevitable. This madness must be stopped, he declared at a secret gathering of like-minded nobles. If we allow every scarred peasant and deviant outcast to believe they deserve the same consideration as their betters, the entire structure of civilization will collapse. He assembled an army of those who felt threatened by the new ideas spreading from the transformed castle, mercenaries who profited from conflict, priests who derived authority from convincing people they were sinful and unworthy, traders who made their fortunes from the desperation of the powerless. But when Mordain's forces approached the castle, they found that conventional warfare was no longer effective against the new reality that had taken root there. Their weapons passed harmlessly through defenders who had learned to exist partially in multiple dimensions. Their attempts to set fires were quenched by rains that fell from clear skies. Their siege engines crumbled when touched by children whose innocence had been transformed into a kind of protective magic. More significantly, many of Mordain's own soldiers began deserting when they saw what the castle had become. Mercenaries who had known only violence discovered they had the capacity for gentleness. Soldiers who had been taught that strength meant dominating others learned that true power came from lifting others up. The siege collapsed, not through military defeat, but through transformation. Those who came to destroy ended up being healed instead, their anger and fear dissolved by prolonged exposure to unconditional acceptance and genuine love. Mordain himself was the last holdout, standing alone before the castle gates as his entire army either fled or joined the community they had come to destroy. "This is unnatural," he shouted at the castle walls. "People are not meant to be equal. There must be order, hierarchy, someone to rule, and someone to serve. Without proper distinctions, society will crumble into chaos." Serafina appeared on the castle walls, her scarred face serene and compassionate. She looked down at the man who had come to destroy everything she had built, and she felt not anger, but profound sadness for the fear and limitation that drove his hatred. "You're right that there must be order," she said, her voice carrying clearly to where he stood, despite speaking no louder than normal conversation. "But the order we've chosen is based on love rather than fear, on inclusion rather than exclusion, on the belief that everyone has value, rather than the assumption that some people are inherently worth more than others." "Chaos," Mordain spat. "You offer chaos and call it harmony." "I offer transformation," Serafina replied gently. "The same choice I've offered everyone else. The opportunity to become more than your worst impulses, to build something beautiful from whatever pain you've carried, to discover that your value doesn't depend on someone else having less value than you." For a moment, something flickered in Mordain's eyes. Uncertainty, possibility, a glimpse of the fear and pain that had driven him to build his life around dominance and exclusion. But then his face hardened again, and he turned away from the castle. "Keep your madness," he said, "but know that there are still those of us who understand the true nature of the world. who will not be seduced by pretty words about acceptance and equality. He rode away alone, unwilling to accept the transformation that was being offered freely to anyone who wanted it. Serafina watched him go with profound sadness, understanding that some people would always choose fear over love, limitation over possibility, the familiar pain of separation over the vulnerable joy of connection. But she also knew that his ritual of healing didn't invalidate the healing itself. The transformation would continue, spreading through the world, one heart at a time, one community at a time, one choice at a time. Years passed in the mortal realm, while centuries flowed by in the Bridge Kingdom, where time moved according to need rather than arbitrary measurement. The influence of Serafina's choice continued to spread, not through conquest or coercion, but through the simple power of example. Children who had grown up in the transformed communities became adults who carried new assumptions about worth and belonging wherever they went. They started families, founded businesses, created art, and governed communities according to principles of inclusion and mutual support rather than competition and exclusion. The stories of the Scarred Queen became part of the cultural fabric, told and retold, with variations that reflected each community's particular struggles and triumphs. In some versions, she was a healer who mended not just individual wounds, but the rifts between entire peoples. In others, she was a warrior who fought not with sword and shield, but with compassion and understanding that proved stronger than any weapon. But all the stories shared certain common elements: a person marked by suffering, who chose transformation over revenge, who created bridges instead of walls, who proved that the things that make us different can become our greatest sources of strength. In the Bridge realm itself, Serafina continued to evolve and grow. The palace had expanded beyond anything that could be contained in a single location, becoming a living network of connections that existed wherever people chose love over fear, acceptance over rejection, complexity over simplicity. She could manifest wherever she was needed, in the bedroom of a child who felt like a monster because of their differences, in the heart of a community torn apart by prejudice and misunderstanding, in the soul of someone who had forgotten their own worth and needed to be reminded that they were precious, exactly as they were. Nocturnus had become the guardian of transitions. He appeared to those who were dying, to help them cross over peacefully, to those who were being born, to welcome them into existence with love, to those who were changing from one state of being to another, to guide them through the transformation with gentleness and wisdom. His role was to ensure that no one had to face life's most difficult moments alone, that every transition was supported by love and understanding, rather than fear and abandonment. Malakar's transformation had been perhaps the most profound of all. Once driven by a hunger to possess and control, he had become a guide for those who had lost their way, who had made terrible choices and believed themselves beyond redemption. He showed them, through his own example, that no one was too far gone to begin again, that every moment offered the possibility of choosing differently. His realm was filled with those who had been society's outcasts, criminals seeking redemption, addicts fighting for sobriety, abusers learning to break cycles of violence, anyone who carried the weight of shame and guilt and needed to discover that their past mistakes didn't define their future possibilities. Together, the three of them had created something unprecedented in any realm, a space where healing was always possible, where love was unconditional, where everyone could find belonging, regardless of what wounds they carried or what mistakes they had made. But as their influence spread and more souls found healing, new challenges began to emerge. The balance between realms was shifting in ways that even they hadn't anticipated. Powers that had remained dormant for millennia were stirring, ancient forces that viewed the integration of light and shadow as a threat to the cosmic order. A new prophecy began to emerge from the deepest oracles, spoken by seers who had never communicated directly with any mortal realm before. When the bridge stands strong and the wounded find healing, when love conquers fear and sets hearts to reeling, the ancient ones wake from their slumber profound. Their judgment shall shake both heaven and ground. The queen of integration must face the first test, Can unity stand when put to the crest? Will love prove stronger than primordial might, or fall to powers that predate both darkness and light? Seraphina felt the new prophecy resonating through her being, like a bell tolling in dimensions beyond counting. She understood instinctively that their work was far from finished, that creating the bridge realm had been only the beginning of a much larger transformation that would affect not just the realms they knew, but the fundamental structure of existence itself. The Ancient Ones, Nocturnus, said when they gathered to discuss the emerging threat. I remember stories from before my imprisonment, legends of powers so old they existed before the concepts of light and shadow were even separated. They are forces of pure order, pure control, who view any change to the established patterns as chaos that must be corrected. And they're awakening because of what we've done, Malakara added, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding. Our integration of opposites, our refusal to maintain the traditional boundaries. They see it as a corruption of the natural order that threatens everything they've spent eons maintaining. Seraphina nodded, feeling the truth of their words resonating in her transformed consciousness. She had known, on some level, that their actions would have consequences beyond what they could foresee. Creating something genuinely new always disturbed existing patterns, and there were powers in the universe that valued stability above all else, even if that stability was built on suffering and limitation. Then we prepare, she said simply. We continue the work of healing and integration. We help as many souls as possible discover their worth and power, and we trust that love really is stronger than control, that growth is more valuable than stagnation, that the universe itself wants to evolve rather than remain forever frozen in patterns that no longer serve the highest good. And if the Ancient Ones prove too powerful, Nocturnus asked, if they succeed in destroying what we've built and forcing reality back into the old patterns of separation and hierarchy, Seraphina smiled, her scarred face radiant with a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from deep understanding of the forces they had set in motion. Then we will have planted seeds that can survive any winter, she said. Every person who has learned to love themselves despite their scars, every community that has chosen inclusion over exclusion, every child who has grown up believing that their differences make them precious rather than worthless. They carry the truth we've discovered. Even if the bridge realm were destroyed tomorrow, those seeds would continue to grow and spread and transform the universe one heart at a time. She looked out over their impossible realm, watching beings from every dimension learning to live together in harmony, witnessing daily miracles of healing and transformation and love. That's what the Ancient Ones don't understand, she continued. They think power comes from control, from maintaining rigid structures and hierarchies. But real power comes from empowerment, from helping others discover their own strength, their own worth, their own capacity to create positive change. That kind of power multiplies rather than diminishes when it's shared. It becomes unstoppable, not through force, but through inspiration. The challenge ahead would test every principle they had established, every belief about the power of love and acceptance and integration. But Seraphina felt no fear, only profound determination to prove that the universe was ready to evolve beyond the limitations that had constrained it for eons. The real battle was about to begin, not a war fought with weapons or magic, but a fundamental contest between two visions of what existence could become. The Ancient Ones manifested, not as individual beings, but as a collective force that seemed to exist in the spaces between atoms, in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence between thoughts. Their presence was felt rather than seen, a crushing weight of disapproval that made reality itself seem to groan under the pressure of their judgment. When they spoke, their voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through dimensions that had no names. Integration bringer, chaos sower, boundary breaker. Each word hit like a physical blow, carrying the weight of cosmic authority that had existed since the first moment of creation. You have disrupted the sacred order. Light must remain light. Shadow must remain shadow. Separation maintains stability. Unity breeds chaos. The very air in the bridge realm began to crystallize under the pressure of their presence, threatening to freeze every living being in place like insects trapped in amber. But Seraphina stood firm at the center of her impossible palace, her scarred face serene and unafraid. Order built on suffering is not sacred, she replied, her voice carrying equal power, but with warmth where theirs held unequal authority. Separation that prevents growth is not stability, it's stagnation. You know nothing of consequence. Your mortal perspective is limited to fragments of existence. We have maintained balance for eons beyond counting. Balance? Seraphina laughed, and the sound carried such genuine joy that it created cracks in the crystallizing air around them.
You call it balance when light and shadow tear at each other eternally, when beings are forced to choose between aspects of themselves instead of integrating them, when love requires the destruction of everything that seems different or threatening.
She gestured to the realm around them, where beings of every conceivable nature lived in harmony, not the brittle peace of enforced separation, but the dynamic equilibrium of conscious cooperation. This is balance, not the static tension of opposed forces, held apart by force, but the living dance of apparent opposites, discovering they're part of the same whole. Temporary aberration, chaos masquerading as harmony. It will collapse into discord. Will it? Nocturnus stepped forward to stand beside Seraphina, his presence adding strength to hers. Then why are more souls choosing this path every day? Why are communities throughout the realms adopting principles of inclusion and integration rather than exclusion and separation? Malika joined them, completing the trinity that had transformed not just their own natures, but the fundamental possibilities of existence itself. Because it works, he said simply, because beings who are allowed to be complete, light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, individual and connected, are happier, healthier, more creative, more loving than those forced to deny half of their nature. The Ancient One's response was to intensify their pressure, trying to force reality back into the rigid patterns they preferred. Seraphina felt the weight of their disapproval, like a mountain settling on her shoulders, trying to crush her back into the limited role they believed she should occupy. But instead of resisting the pressure directly, she did something unexpected. She embraced it. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude that shocked the Ancient Ones into momentary silence. "Thank you for showing me the final piece of the puzzle." She opened her arms wide, and instead of fighting against the cosmic force trying to constrain her, she welcomed it into herself. The crushing weight of their judgment became part of her, integrated into her being, just as she had integrated light and shadow, just as she had embraced both her scars and her beauty. "You represent order, control, the desire for everything to remain safely predictable," she said as their power flowed through her, transformed by her acceptance from destructive force into creative energy. And that's not wrong, it's just incomplete. Order without growth becomes stagnation, control without trust becomes tyranny, predictability without possibility becomes death. The Ancient Ones tried to withdraw their power, realizing too late that she was transforming their opposition into fuel for further integration. But it was already part of her, woven into the fabric of her being, just as thoroughly as the love and acceptance she had cultivated. "I choose to include you too," she declared, her voice now carrying harmonics that spanned every possible frequency of existence. "You're not our enemies. You're the part of the cosmic whole that ensures our integration doesn't dissolve into chaos, that our acceptance doesn't become mere permissiveness, that our love doesn't lack the structure needed to remain stable and sustainable." The transformation that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred in any realm or dimension. The Ancient Ones, who had existed as pure control and order, found themselves experiencing growth and change for the first time in their existence. The sensation was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. They discovered that order could evolve, that control could be exercised through empowerment rather than domination, that stability could be dynamic rather than static. They learned that their desire for predictability could coexist with room for surprise, that their need for structure could support rather than constrain the flowering of infinite possibilities. And in return, Seraphina's integration gained the wisdom of ages, the deep understanding of cosmic patterns that the ancient ones had accumulated over eons of existence. Her love gained structure, her acceptance gained discernment, her transformation gained the stability needed to endure across millennia. The bridge realm expanded again, becoming something that existed not just between the known realms, but between all possible states of being. It became a space where order and chaos danced together, where control and freedom found perfect balance, where ancient wisdom and innovative possibility combined to create solutions that neither could achieve alone. This is the final integration, Serafina realized as she felt her consciousness commanding to encompass perspectives she had never imagined. Not just light and shadow, not just love and pain, but order and chaos, tradition and innovation, wisdom and wonder, all of it woven together into something greater than any single element could be. From her transformed perspective, she could see the entire tapestry of existence, every choice that led to separation, every decision that chose integration, every soul that found healing, every heart that opened to love. She saw that their work was indeed just beginning, that the seeds they had planted would continue growing for eons to come, gradually transforming the universe itself into something more beautiful, more inclusive, more alive than it had ever been. The Scarred Queen had become something beyond any category or limitation, not a ruler in the traditional sense, but a living embodiment of the principle that all things could be made whole, that no one was beyond redemption, that love really was the fundamental force that connected all existence. Her story would continue forever, told and retold and lived out fresh in every being who chose integration over separation, healing over wounding, love over fear. She had proved that even the deepest scars could become sources of the most radiant beauty, that the greatest love stories were not about perfection, but about the courage to be complete. In dimensions beyond counting, in hearts throughout all the realms, her truth echoed eternal. Everyone is worthy of love, exactly as they are, and everyone has the power to transform their pain into their greatest gift to the world.